Being too aware of everything is not intelligence. It is not a gift that life decided to give you. The truth is, people who live with this are tired, constantly, deeply tired, even when nothing worth worrying about has happened. A text that took a little longer to come back. A glance across the room that lasted half a second too long. A sentence that sounded perfectly normal but felt slightly off. For most people, those things disappear the moment they happen. For you, before you even realize it, you are already thinking about them, and it takes a long time before you stop. And the strange part is, you know that. You know you are overthinking. You know the other person was probably just busy. But knowing does not help, because your mind keeps doing what it has always done. Psychology calls this hyper-awareness. But this video is not here to explain what it is, because if you are still watching, you already know what it feels like. This is about something else. A truth that most people living with this state have never really looked straight at. That the thing they think of as their strength, the thing they have learned to accept or even take pride in, is actually being used in a completely different way. A way they have not yet seen. Many people assume they are simply too sensitive, or introverted, or anxious. But being wired to notice everything is not quite any of those things, even though it can exist alongside them. An introvert needs time alone to recover. An anxious person fears specific things. But someone who feels everything too deeply can be completely outgoing, completely composed in front of others, and still come home carrying a weight of information in their head that they do not know what to do with. Psychology divides this into two groups with very different origins. The first group was born this way. In 1996, psychologist Elaine Aron gave this phenomenon its first formal name: sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS. Roughly 15 to 20% of the population carries this trait. Their nervous system processes information at a deeper level than most people. Not because they are weaker, but because their brain is built to filter and analyze everything more thoroughly by default. They did not choose this. It was there from the beginning. But there is a second group, and this is the one almost nobody talks about. These people were not born this way. Their awareness was created, taught, by an environment where failing to notice every small shift around them was something they simply could not afford. Neuroscience calls this hypervigilance, a state of constant alertness that the amygdala maintains after exposure to an unsafe environment. Think of a child growing up in a home where the moods of the adults around them shifted without warning. That child had no choice but to learn how to read every signal. The tone of a voice, the sound of footsteps, the way a door was closed. Not because they were unusually perceptive, but because it was the only way they knew how to protect themselves. And when that child grows up, the survival mechanism does not disappear. It follows them into offices, into relationships, into conversations where there is nothing dangerous happening at all. The amygdala remembers the lesson it learned long ago. The environment is not safe until proven otherwise. And it keeps scanning for threats, even when those threats stopped existing a very long time ago. Whether you were born this way or shaped by circumstance, the experience in the present is the same. The mind does not rest. The eyes do not switch off. And the exhaustion builds in a way that people on the outside simply cannot understand. But this is only the surface. Underneath, there is a mechanism that even people who feel everything too deeply rarely see running inside themselves. There is a scientific reason why their mind never truly rests. In most people, there is a brain network called the default mode network, the DMN, that activates when they are not focused on any specific task. Waiting in line, staring out a window, standing in the shower. That is when the DMN switches on, and then quiets down when attention is needed again. In people who are too aware, the DMN almost never fully quiets. It keeps running in parallel even while they are focused on something else, analyzing, comparing, filing things away. Neuroscientist Marcus Raichle, who first described the DMN in 2001, called this the brain's resting state. But for someone who feels everything too deeply, that resting state never really arrives. That is why they can sit through a completely ordinary meeting and walk out feeling like they just carried something much heavier than anyone else in the room. But the DMN is only part of the story. In 2014, researcher Bianca Acevedo and her colleagues used fMRI to observe the brains of people with sensory processing sensitivity as they looked at images of other people's emotions. The results showed that the insula and anterior cingulate cortex, two regions directly involved in empathy and emotional processing, were significantly more active than in the average person. When they saw someone in pain, their brain did not simply register that information. It responded as though they were experiencing it themselves. They do not choose to feel other people's emotions. Their brain does it before they even realize it is happening. For those whose hypervigilance was shaped by their environment, there is another layer. The amygdala, the brain region that processes threat responses, was trained early to treat the surrounding environment as unsafe until proven otherwise. Daniel Goleman, in Emotional Intelligence, called this an amygdala hijack, when the amygdala takes over the body's response before the rational brain has any chance to intervene. A text message with no exclamation mark. A coworker who walks past without looking up. The amygdala reads those signals as warnings, and the body responds accordingly, even when nothing is actually happening. And then there is interoception, the ability to sense the internal state of the body, processed by the insular cortex, first described by neuroscientist A.D. Craig in 2009. People who are too aware tend to have an exceptionally sensitive interoception system. A slightly faster heartbeat after a cup of coffee. A faint tension in the shoulders after a conversation. The brain filters those signals through their entire emotional history and sometimes concludes that something is wrong, even when nothing is. All of these mechanisms explain why they are exhausted, but they do not yet explain something more important. Why awareness, the very thing that should help them live more deeply, is being used in a completely different way, a way they have not yet seen. There is a question that most hyper-aware people have never really sat down and asked themselves. Not, why am I like this? They have asked that one many times already. The question they have never asked is, what am I actually using this for? I see through people. What for? I sense every shift in the room. What for? I analyze every small signal in a conversation. To connect more deeply, or to never be caught off guard by pain? For most of them, the answer is the second one. People who grew up in unsafe environments learned a lesson very early, and that lesson worked so well that the brain wrote it in as a rule for survival. If you can see what is coming, you will not be hurt as badly. If you can read the other person's mood before they say a word, you will have time to prepare. If you already know the worst case, it cannot knock you down. And that lesson protected them. It worked. But then they grew up. That house was gone. The people who once made them feel like they always had to be ready were no longer there. But the way they looked at the world, the way they read people, tracked every signal, prepared for every possible outcome, stayed. Because it was never something they decided to do. It was something they became. And so they kept going, scanning for threat in conversations where nothing dangerous was happening, analyzing the motives of someone who simply wanted to invite them to dinner, running through worst-case scenarios for a relationship that had barely begun, while the other person was still just trying to figure out what they liked for breakfast. Psychologist Julie Norham calls this defensive pessimism, the tendency to imagine the worst possible outcomes in advance as a way of preparing. For some people, it works well enough. But for someone who is hyper-aware, it does not stop at preparation. It becomes the way they experience everything. And this is the part that hurts the most. When you always know in advance, or believe that you do, what is going to happen, you are no longer actually experiencing it. You are managing it. A date is no longer a date. It is a test you are grading answer by answer. A new friendship is no longer a friendship. It is a risk you are calculating to see if it is worth the investment. Someone tells you they care about you, and instead of letting that land, you start looking for the reason it might not be true. This is not wisdom. This is isolation dressed up as insight. And this needs to be said clearly. They did not choose to live this way. This way of seeing was formed when they were far too young to have any other option. It was once the best thing they could do to protect themselves. The problem is not that they were wrong. The problem is that they are still looking at their life through the eyes of a child who was in danger, long after that danger stopped being real. People often describe hyperawareness as a problem of exhaustion, of overthinking. But that is only what is visible from the outside. The real cost runs much deeper. They are not fully present in their own life. They are there, they participate, they laugh, they respond, but a part of them is always standing slightly back, watching, noting, evaluating. They look at their own life the way someone looks through a window. Everything is visible. Nothing can be touched. And this is the paradox that almost nobody sees. The people who understand others most deeply are the ones who experience the least. They can describe the psychology of a partner more accurately than that partner can describe themselves. They see a relationship beginning to fracture before the people inside it do. They sense the shift in a conversation before anyone has said a word. But ask them when the last time was that they truly let themselves fall into a moment, without analyzing it, without evaluating it, without quietly preparing an exit, and many of them will not have an answer. They have never really been inside that moment. They have been managing it. And then there is a kind of loneliness they have never been able to explain to anyone. They see too much of what the people around them do not see, and after a while, they stop trying to point it out. The distance between what they notice and what others are willing to acknowledge becomes too wide to close with words. And that distance does not only exist between them and the world. It exists between them and themselves. Psychologist Stephen Hayes, the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy, calls this experiential avoidance, when a person continuously analyzes their emotions from a distance instead of actually living inside them. And that distance accumulates over years, quietly, until many people do not realize it is happening until they look back and see that their life has passed like something they watched, rather than something they lived. What they lose is the feeling of actually being inside their own life. The surprise of something happening before they had a chance to predict it. The experience of trusting someone simply, without needing to verify. Loving without calculating in advance how much they are risking. Those things are not luxuries. They are what make life feel like life, rather than a project being carefully managed one day at a time. The problem has never been awareness. The problem is the question that awareness has been used to answer. For many years, for most people living with this, it has only ever answered one question. How do I keep myself from getting hurt? That question had its reasons. It was once necessary. It was once the only thing that kept them standing. But a capacity deep enough to see through people, sensitive enough to pick up on things others walk past, that capacity deserves to serve a different question. Not what could happen to me here, but what is actually happening here, and how do I want to be present in it? That is the difference between using awareness to defend and using awareness to be present. One keeps them safe but standing outside. The other keeps them safe while staying inside. And the distance between those two is not a distance of technique or method. It is the distance of a choice. One that, perhaps for the first time, is actually theirs to make. They do not need to become less sensitive. They do not need to turn anything off. What they have carried all these years, the ability to see deeply into people, to feel what others cannot feel, to understand what does not need to be said, all of it is still there, and still worth something. What changes is not the awareness. What changes is the reason they use it. If there was a moment in this video where you recognized something about yourself, leave a comment about that moment. Not to share it with anyone else, but because naming it is the first step toward looking at it honestly.